So very good morning. So today we will look into other system changes that occurs during muscular exercise. So in the last class we have seen the cardiovascular changes during muscular exercise in terms of heart rate, in terms of stroke volume, in terms of cardiac output, in terms of blood flow, and in terms of blood volume. So today we will look into other parameters or other system changes that is seen during muscular exercise. So as you know, regular exercise is a very important thing which everyone need to perform daily. So as a result, it will prevent from various diseases that can happen, it can prevent diabetes, it can prevent stroke, it can prevent cardiac arrest, and it will reduce the cardiac mortality morbidity. So overall it improves the cardiovascular function, it reduces blood pressure, it decreases body weight, it improves the lipid profile, it improves the glucose control, it decreases anxiety, depression. Generally they recommend 30 minutes of moderate intensity exercise to reduce the risk of sedentary lifestyle diseases. So respiratory changes, what you can see first is the increase in the pulmonary ventilation. So normal pulmonary ventilation is 6 liters per minute. So pulmonary ventilation is equal to respiratory rate times the tidal volume. So generally what will happen, respiratory ventilation can go up to 20 to 25 times the normal value. So as you see from this graph, like the pulmonary ventilation has been linearly increasing with the exercise intensity. It can go up to maximum of 100 or 110 liters per minute. So what are the causes of increase in the pulmonary ventilation, we'll see in the next class. So here in this graph you will be looking into what are the changes in the blood chemistry that is happening during and with the exercise. So you can see here, so there will be not much change in the arteriolar partial pressure of oxygen, not much change in the arteriolar partial pressure of carbon dioxide, not much change in the arterial pH, except if in a severe exercise there is a drop in the pH, and at the same time you can see a linear increase in the pulmonary ventilation with the exercise intensity. So this graph is quite important. So change in blood gases and change in pH with exercise. So next slide is, this is a very important slide which you need to know. Exercise generally increases the oxygen consumption, increase carbon dioxide, increase ventilation. So this is achieved due to a change in the blood chemistry. Generally what will happen, there will be not much change in the partial pressure of oxygen arteriolar, not much change in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide at arteriolar, no change of pH or a decreased pH that is seen in maximum exercise. Whereas the venous side, there will be increase in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. At the same time pulmonary blood flow increases, there will be ventilation perfusion ratio increases, at the same time decrease in the dead space volume. And what will happen to the oxygen dissociation curve? So that is shift to right. So there will be a Bohr's effect that is taking place at the tissue level. So this will decrease the affinity of oxygen to the binding, so more oxygen is being delivered to the tissues. So as you know, the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, what are the factors that will shift to right, what are the factors that will shift to left. So here the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve is being shifted to right. So what are the factors or the causes that increase the pulmonary ventilation during exercise? So the graph we have seen already. So there is a linear increase in the pulmonary ventilation with the exercise intensity. So main factor is the psychic stimuli, cerebral cortex influence, proprioceptor influence, increase in the body temperature, increase in the lactate, increase in the plasma potassium level, small fluctuation in the arteriolar oxygen and carbon dioxide. So that will stimulate the carotid bodies to increase the ventilation. So this will cause several factors that will influence, and like cerebral cortex influence, proprioceptive influence, increase in body temperature, increase in lactate, increase in plasma potassium level, small fluctuation in oxygen and carbon dioxide. So all this will increase the pulmonary ventilation. So this diagram you can see, like the role of higher centers, role of peripheral chemoreceptors, role of proprioceptors, all this acting on the respiratory center to increase the pulmonary ventilation. So, do the lung limit the exercise performance? Generally, in a healthy individual, it does not limit the lung performance. But when you are ascending to high altitude or in a disease state, like a person suffering from COPD, fibrosis, emphysema, and so on, so it will limit the lung performance. So we will look into what will happen to the oxygen consumption, maximum oxygen consumption. So for a muscle to contract, they need energy to form ATP. So the cardiovascular system is responsible for the three basic processes to produce this energy, to get more oxygen into the blood by increasing oxygen carrying capacity, more oxygen delivery to the muscle, so they extract the oxygen from the blood to form ATP. So the oxygen carrying capacity is affected by two primary functions. So ability of the lungs to ventilate. Number two, it depends on the hemoglobin concentration in the blood. So the oxygen delivery is the function of cardiac output. So the cardiac output is equal to stroke volume and heart rate. So stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped during each heartbeat, which is 70 ml. So cardiac output increases due to increase in stroke volume and increase in heart rate. So basically the heart rate increases linearly with the intensity of exercise, whereas stroke volume increases up to 40 to 50% of maximum exercise capacity, and then it reaches a plateau. What is oxygen extraction? So oxygen extraction from the tissue, from the blood to the tissue, depends on the type of muscle fiber that is being recruited during exercise, and also depends on the availability of oxidative enzymes. So generally, slow twitch type of skeletal muscle fibers are specially adapted for oxygen extraction and utilization. So here the aerobic production of ATPs occurs in mitochondria. Circulatory system increases the blood flow into the active muscle and decreases blood flow to the non-active muscles such as viscera, allowing higher concentration to be extracted. So what is the supply of energy to the body? So supply of energy to the body comes from the whatever the stored energy in the form of ATP, and also the ATPs are generated from whatever the food we ingest, like carbohydrate, fat, and protein. So you can see here the fat get converted to fatty acids, they yield ATP, and apart from that some amount of fats are also stored. Glucose generally yields ATP by metabolic pathway and also stores, glucose gets stored as glycogen. Amino acids, majority of amino acid contribute to the growth and repair of tissue, and apart from that some amount of amino acids also enters into metabolic pathway to generate ATPs. So the three energy systems available during exercise. One is anaerobic, where it involves the breakdown of creatine phosphate and stored ATP to resynthesize ATP for immediate use. For immediate use, its anaerobic comes into play. And second is the anaerobic glycolysis. It involves breakdown of glucose and glycogen to form ATP. The third is the aerobic glycolysis. So aerobic glycolysis, aerobic metabolism of fat yields larger amount of ATP compared to glucose. So breakdown of fat and glucose metabolism, which you can see here. So it's all interlinked. So anaerobic glycolysis in the cytoplasm, so glucose get converted to pyruvate, and during this process ATP is generated, and this pyruvate enters into the mitochondria, get converted to acetyl CoA. It enters into Krebs cycle where it generates ATP. Inside the mitochondria, whatever the fat, due to beta oxidation, it gets converted to acetyl CoA. This acetyl CoA enters into Krebs cycle and generate ATP. The next is the respiratory exchange ratio. So respiratory exchange ratio is the ratio of carbon dioxide produced relative to the amount of oxygen. So this is a formula constituting carbon dioxide divided by oxygen consumed. So normal, so it is a marker for a proportion of fat or carbohydrate that is being used for fuel at different intensity during steady state exercise. At rest, this value is 0.75, meaning the body is burning approximately 85% of fat and 15% of carbon dioxide. As the exercise intensity increases, this RER increases, so large amount of carbon dioxide and is being burnt and less percentage of fat is being burnt. Like oxygen consumption is a very important thing. The more oxygen a person can take in, deliver and utilize, the performance of that person will be much better. The maximum oxygen consumption refers to one's maximum oxygen. So VO2 max refers to one's maximum oxygen consumption. So it is expressed either relative or it is expressed absolute. So relative allows the comparison between individual. Absolute maximum oxygen consumption is used to determine the caloric expenditure during specific activity. So the resting oxygen consumption is 250 ml per minute. During heavy exercise, it increases to 15 to 20 times. So due to increase in the arteriovenous oxygen difference, increase in the oxygen delivery to tissue due to increase in cardiac output, increase in alveolar ventilation, increase in capillary density, increase in the RBC count due to sphenic contraction. So oxygen consumption during aerobic exercise. As soon as aerobic exercise begins, more ATP is required. To meet this demand, sympathetic system take over. It increases cardiac output. It increases the release of catecholamines, which prepares the body to increase metabolic demand. So once the exercise begins, once you start the exercise, it takes 2 to 4 minutes for the body to meet the increased demand for oxygen. So during this time, the 2 to 4 minutes, anaerobic system take over. So when the cardiovascular system is fully ready, a new level of steady state oxygen consumption is achieved. So this graph is very important graph related to oxygen consumption. So there are two things which you need to know from this graph is there are 3 levels. So there are 3 levels or 3 phases that is taking place in a muscular exercise related to oxygen deficit and oxygen depth. So first phase, what we call it, an adaptation phase, where there will be oxygen deficit takes place. So early phase of exercise, like 2 to 5 minutes. So this phase is called as the oxygen deficit phase. Then it enters into a steady phase or a plateau phase. So this is the phase of maximum oxygen consumption. The next phase, what we call it as recovery phase. So the next this phase, last phase is called as recovery phase. After stoppage of exercise, extra amount of oxygen is consumed. So we call it this as extra post-exercise oxygen consumption. So during this time, what will happen? There will be an oxygen depth that takes place to repay the oxygen deficit. So why this oxygen depth takes place? To remove the excess of lactate to regenerate the ATP stores and to regenerate creatinine phosphate to replace the oxygen that was extracted out from myoglobin during muscular exercise. So basically there are three phases that takes place in this oxygen deficit and oxygen depth. First is the adaptive phase, that's the early phase of exercise, 2 to 5 minutes, where oxygen consumption increases linearly with exercise, so there will be oxygen deficit takes place. Then it enters into a steady phase or a plateau phase. This is the phase of maximum oxygen consumption. After this phase there will be a phase, what we call it a recovery phase. In this recovery phase there will be an oxygen depth that takes place, what we call it as excess post exercise oxygen consumption. So next is the threshold, anaerobic threshold. So anaerobic threshold is reached when exercise intensity increases above the steady state aerobic metabolism and anaerobic metabolism of ATP occur. So what will happen when the anaerobic threshold is crossed? Exercise can be sustained for few minutes before an hyperventilation begins to occur. So why this hyperventilation occurs? One is due to lactate accumulation, the other is due to excess carbon dioxide accumulation. So that lead to increase in respiration, what we call it as second ventilatory threshold. So there are two ventilatory threshold that encounters in a muscular exercise. First ventilatory threshold, second ventilatory threshold. So first ventilatory threshold occurs as soon as blood lactate begins to accumulate in the body. The second ventilatory threshold occurs as blood lactate rapidly increases with intensity, and as a result of this increased ventilation past the need to get rid of carbon dioxide. So what are the chronic training adaptation to exercise, which I have already told in the first slide? It improves the cardiovascular efficiency, it improves the respiratory efficiency, it improves the maximum oxygen consumption, it increases the bone density, it improves the blood glucose level, it improves the lipid profile, it maintains the body lean mass, it decreases depression, anxiety, and so on. So there are two types of muscle fibers in the skeletal muscles, and what are the role of these two types of muscle fibers and which type of exercise it suits for. So fast twitch muscle fibers generally they utilize primarily the creatinine phosphate pathway and anaerobic glycolysis energy system. They are specialized for anaerobic metabolism, and fast twitch fibers innervates more muscle fibers, allowing greater force production. So greater force to, whereas the slow twitch fibers are well equipped for oxygen delivery. They have got good amount of oxidative enzymes, they have high amount of mitochondria, which suits best for aerobic glycolysis and fatty acid oxidation. So they used for low intensity long duration activity, and they are usually abundant in fat resistant muscle or postural muscles. So the proportion of this fast twitch and slow twitch fibers mainly are genetically determined. So most of the people have got equal percentage of fast twitch and slow twitch fibers. The person better at low intensity endurance have got a higher percentage of slow twitch fibers. The person performing an high intensity or a sudden burst of activity have got high percentage of fast twitch fibers. So there is in between the slow twitch and the fast twitch, there is one more type of fibers that is present, what intermediate fibers, which has a high capacity for both fast anaerobic and slow aerobic movements. So the muscle fiber responds to training. So these three types of muscle fiber are highly trainable. So they adapt to specific demand placed on them. So the muscle fibers are recruited sequentially in response to force generation. So slow twitch, then fast twitch. So the fast twitch fibers are more rapidly related to causing hypertrophy or increase in size in the fibers in response to strength program. Muscle endurance training is specific to both slow twitch and fast twitch fibers. The endocrine system also plays an important role, or some changes that are taking place in the muscular exercise to regulate the cellular metabolism, to facilitate the cardiovascular function, to facilitate the transport of substances across cell membrane, to increase the secretory activity, to modulate protein synthesis. So what are the hormones that comes into play during muscular exercise? One is the growth hormone. So grow first and foremost is the growth hormone secreted from anterior pituitary, which facilitate protein synthesis and also has got insulin like growth factor functions. The second is the ADH, also called vasopressin. So they reduce urinary excretion of water in response to dehydrating effect of sweat. Epinephrine, norepinephrine are also called as catecholamines. They are a part of sympathetic nervous system. So they increase the cardiac output and also they stimulate the glycogen breakdown in the liver. The other hormones are aldosterone and cortisol also play a very important role. So aldosterone limits the sodium excretion in urine to maintain fluid and electrolyte balance, whereas cortisol promotes the protein and triglyceride breakdown, so which aids in the maintenance of blood glucose. Apart from that, insulin and glucagon also very plays an important role. So these are secreted from pancreas. So insulin is active when blood glucose level are high, whereas glucagon are active when blood glucose level are low. So this will stimulate glucose release from the liver. Apart from that, there are some role of testosterone and estrogen. So testosterone for anabolic effect, estrogen for maintaining feminine character and bone formation maintaining, play an important role in amenorrhea. Exercising in heat, what will happen in a humid environment? What are the changes that takes place in the body? How to overcome this? What will happen to body if you are exercising in a cold environment? So exercising in a heat environment, so what will happen during exercise? The internal heat load is brought to the skin surface to be cooled via the secretion of water by sweat glands. So there will be a lot of evaporation that takes place. So what are the two changes that takes place when you are doing exercising in heat? It can lead to complication. One is heat exhaustion, heat stroke. Two things that can encounter if you are doing exercise in a hot or a humid environment. So there can be heat exhaustion and heat stroke. So there are some tips that you can overcome to prevent this heat exhaustion and heat stroke. So you need to begin the exercise gradually, take adequate amount of body fluids, always wear lightweight clothes, record body weight regularly, and so on. So what will happen if you are exercising in a cold environment? So cold environment generally excess loss of body heat lead to generalized vasoconstriction that lead to some complication of like hypothermia, frostbite, and increased blood pressure. So there are some tips to overcome this development of hypothermia or frostbite or increased blood pressure. So you need to wear several layer of garments that can be easily removed, allow adequate ventilation for sweat, wear garments made of material that allow body to give off the heat during exercise, replace the body fluid in the cold, monitor body temperature at regular interval. So this completes the lecture of physiology of exercise. In the physiology of exercise, we have dealt with the introduction to exercise. We have dealt with grading of exercise, cardiovascular changes, respiratory changes, endocrine changes, what are the temperature effect, pH effect, and what are the phases of oxygen depth, oxygen deficit and oxygen depth, and what are the metabolic changes that occurs in the exercise, and what are the types of skeletal muscle fiber and which fiber suit to which type of exercise, and lastly what are the effect of chronic, what are the specific changes that takes place in the body due to chronic exercise. You do exercise for long duration, what are the benefits to the body? Thank you very much.